Draco Malfoy and the Letter from the Future by Draco will hear about this. Chapter 5 of Meddling Gryffindors and a Mother's Love. As November passed and snow started falling onto the Hogwarts grounds, Draco learned two things. The first was that Hermione Granger, though he had always thought her an annoying know-it-all, was a very useful friend to have. It was not that Draco needed help with his studies, but she was usually a much more competent conversation partner than Harry or especially Weasley, and when they did their homework together, he picked up interesting details he would not have thought of himself. Not only did this win Hermione Draco's respect, but she also turned out much more relaxed and less annoying now that he had actual friends to hang out with. It made Draco wonder how he'd have behaved if he'd been all alone in the school without Harry to rely on. He might have been just as much of a nuisance, he figured, which made him decide to overlook Hermione's behavior for the earlier part of the term altogether. The second thing he learned was that Gryffindors, and especially Harry, were a nosy bunch of tossers. Growing up in a Slytherin environment, Draco had quickly learned not to stick his nose into things that were none of his business unless he wanted it burned, or at least to do it smartly if there was no choice but to. Harry, though, seemed to have missed that part of his education entirely. It had been fun at first, discussing what the three-headed dog was guarding and who it needed guarding against. But when Snape had started limping after his trip to the third-floor corridor on Halloween, and Harry had, quite accidentally, he ensured Draco, overheard Snape admitting that the injury had been caused by the monster, and much worse, had let himself be caught in the act of listening in, Draco began to worry about his obsession. It did not help in the slightest that when Harry's first Quidditch match finally rolled around, someone hexed his broom to throw him off. Draco had been too shell-shocked and scared as he had watched from the Slytherin stands, unable even to breathe until the spell had broken, but Hermione had informed them later on that she had seen Snape cast, and Draco couldn't even bring himself to be surprised about that turn of events. "I'm telling you, Hagrid, it was Snape!" Hermione insisted, as they had gathered in the gamekeeper's hut after the match for a cup of tea. "I can recognize an incantation if I see it.
Rubbish!" Hagrid interrupted him. "Why would he do something like that?"
Harry exchanged a meaningful look with Hermione and Weasley, and Draco prayed inwardly for the other boy to keep his mouth shut.
"No such luck."
"I found out something about him," Harry explained. "He tried to get past that three-headed dog at Halloween. It bit him. We think he was trying to steal whatever it's guarding."
Draco closed his eyes and waited for the lecture on not accusing teachers of such crimes. But it did not come. Instead, he heard a cup crash to the ground as Hagrid gasped, "How do you know about Fluffy?" "Fluffy?" Draco repeated incredulously, opening his eyes again. His reaction was mirrored by the others. "Yeah, he's mine," Hagrid told him. "I bought him off a Greek chappie I met in the pub last year. I lent it to Dumbledore to guard the—" He cut himself off at that point, becoming aware of his almost slip-up. The other three kept prodding at him, arguing with him that Snape could not be trusted. Draco did all he could not to roll his eyes at them.
"No, really," he cut into the argument, choosing his words well. "Stop harassing Hagrid like that. The headmaster has put his trust in him, and he won't break it for us." Weasley stared at him with an open mouth, and Draco frowned in confusion, but Hagrid beamed at Draco.
"You're a good boy, Draco," he boomed. "That's right. What the dog is hiding is between Dumbledore and Nicholas Flamel. It's none of your business."
"I agree," Draco said quickly before the others could even gasp. "I've read about Nicholas Flamel, and he's an important alchemist. For all we know, Fluffy could be hiding the Philosopher's Stone. What good would such information do first-years like us?"
"See?"
Hagrid nodded, throwing a placating look toward the other three.
"That's what I was saying.
Then he yelled in, his dark eyes widening at Draco, who smiled innocently over his cup of tea.
"Crikey," he muttered. "I should never have said anything."
And that was why, though his Gryffindor friends were bigger meddlers than Draco would ever be, they would never be as good at it as a Slytherin.
"What is the Philosopher's Stone?"
Harry asked Draco eagerly as they made their way back up to the castle, having been released by a worried and guilty Hagrid under vows to not tell anyone about what they had just heard. "And how do you know about it?" "I read," Draco said smugly, noting how Weasley rolled his eyes and Hermione looked slightly abashed, as if realizing she had to do more reading if there were things Draco knew and she didn't. "I've always liked alchemy, so I've read a lot about it. The Philosopher's Stone is a legendary substance that contains metals of gold and that is used to create the elixir of life, which can make you immortal. Nicholas Flamel is the only known maker of it, so it wasn't hard to guess what that dog is hiding once he'd name-dropped him," Draco finished offhandedly.
"The elixir of life," Hermione whispered. "That means Snape is after immortality."
"Either that or after gold," Draco shrugged, frowning. "Who knows? If he's really old pals with Father—" He did not finish the sentence, but they all knew what he had meant to say. The possibility that Snape was no stranger to the dark arts was high if he frequented in the same circles as the Malfoy family. "Percy said Snape has always been after the Defense Against the Dark Arts job," Harry noted. "Maybe that's why Dumbledore doesn't trust him enough to give it to him." "Well, maybe he should not trust him enough to let him teach it all," Weasley noted dryly. "Not to mention let him live in the same building where he happens to hide something so bloody important."
Draco quite agreed with Weasley, but he wasn't going to give him the satisfaction of saying it out loud.
Thankfully, as November turned into December and the castle was showered in Christmas decoration, Snape refrained from throwing Harry off brooms or making himself look more suspicious than he already was. So Draco could mostly focus on his studies and simply having fun with his friends instead of babysitting the trouble-seeking Gryffindors. When lists were hung up in their common rooms for people staying at Hogwarts over the holidays to sign in, though, Draco started to get nervous. The source of his nerves did not lie with the fact that Harry was staying with Weasley as company. Jealous as he might tend to get of the redhead, he did not wish for Harry to spend Christmas completely alone. But the prospect of actually facing his parents after the turn his way of thinking had taken in the last couple of months was undoubtedly a cause of worry. Draco had been carefully raised into obedience by his father, and if not for his letter from the future and his consequent friendship with Harry and now even Hermione, he would have never dared to question him. He had always known that the consequences wouldn't be pretty. But now he was friends with the very same boy that had been the downfall of the evil overlord his father had worshipped, a Muggle-born girl, and the youngest son of the most prominent blood traitor family that had ever made it into his father's books. And Draco was quite sure that would not go over well. "You could stay over Christmas too," Harry suggested when Draco voiced his worries to him a few nights before the holidays, while Weasley was exasperatedly trying to teach Hermione to play proper chess a few seats further down the Gryffindor table after dinner. "My parents would never allow it," Draco grimaced. "Mother will insist on having me home." "I see," Harry sighed. "Maybe it won't be as bad as you think. Your mother doesn't seem all that horrible." Draco had to smile at that. The weekly packages of sweets she was sending him via Aquila were infamous between him and Weasley. "Mother is very affectionate," Draco conceded, his stomach churning at the idea of disappointing her. "Don't expect that to continue once she realizes I'm friends with Muggle-born and blood traitors, though." "She's your mother, though," Harry insisted, frowning. "I'm sure she won't stop loving you over the friends you made." Draco stayed silent, instead idly playing with the fir sprigs that decorated the house tables. Draco had quickly realized that, seeing as Harry had never really gotten to know his parents, the boy tended to idealize parent-child relationships, and Draco was acutely aware of how insensitive it would be to argue with him. After all, he should be thankful that his parents were alive and able to show such interest in him. He knew that to Harry, this fact alone seemed something like a dream. Then again, Harry's parents hadn't been bigoted, pure-blood elitists that had sided with the murderer who had tried to kill his best friend. As he sat in the Hogwarts Express a couple of days later, he was a nervous wreck. Hermione did her best to try and distract him, but nothing held his attention for more than a couple of minutes, and the closer they got to London, the more he had to concentrate on keeping his breakfast in.
"Maybe they haven't heard anything about who your friends are?" Hermione pointed out in a valid attempt at being helpful. There's really no need to tell them, is there?
You don't know how families like mine work, Draco sighed. It's a network based on pure blood ideals. They all talk. Did you hear my daughter got top marks in potions? Did you hear my son made the Quidditch team? So I heard your son befriended Muggleborns and blood traitors. You must be so proud.
Why do they care so much?
Hermione sighed in frustration. I mean, as long as you're happy. Because it's what they believe in, Draco muttered. And my grandparents believed it before them, and my great-grandparents before them. It's tradition, and my folks don't like change.
It's a racist tradition, though,
Hermione grumbled. It is, Draco agreed. But what can I do? Is there nothing comparable in the Muggle world?
There is, Hermione conceded, resigned. Only they base it on the colour of skin. The darker the skin, the bigger is the prejudice to certain people.
Well, imagine my parents are those kind of people, and you three have the darkest skin colour imaginable, Draco said moodily.
That comparison doesn't really endear your family to me,
Hermione noted. Oh, believe me, Draco chuckled darkly. That wasn't my intention. As they finally arrived at King's Cross and left the train, Draco quickly spotted his parents among a vast group of people. The Crabs, the Goyles, and the Knots, as far as Draco could tell. His heart fell when he saw Knot already among them, talking fast and laughing derisively in a way that Draco could hear even from where he stood. His father was listening intently, face darkening with every word. His mother was the first to spot Draco. Their eyes met, and she just looked at him, her lips tightening into a hard line. Her expression was hard to read, and before Draco had time to try, his father followed her gaze, and there was no mistaking his expression for silent fury. I'll see you in the new year, Draco sighed, flashing a look at Hermione, who was biting her lip and was wearing a troubled frown. That is, if I survived that long. Hermione seemed as if she wanted to say something encouraging, but with a glance toward Draco's father, she shut her mouth again. Instead, she said softly,
Have a nice Christmas.
Draco wanted to laugh, but his face wouldn't comply, so he just waved at her and wrapped his fingers around the handle of his trunk, pulling it after himself as he made his way over to his parents. Ronald Weasley, his father repeated for the millionth time from the other side of the table, grey eyes burning into his with the force of liquid metal. Harry Potter is one thing. The world loves him, and associating with him can come in handy. I could see that. But the Weasley boy, not to mention the mudblood. Don't call her that, Draco muttered, though his voice was shaking slightly. Don't you dare talk back to me, Draco, his father thundered. By Salazar, you're the head of the Malfoy family. Our family's pure-blood status can be traced back for centuries. Us Malfoys don't associate with riffraff like the Weasleys or Muggles. She's not a Muggle, Draco insisted a little louder now. She's a witch, and she's bloody brilliant. Weasley may be an oaf, but of the many faults he has, the fact that his family doesn't think Muggles are scum is not one of them. There was a moment of silence, and then Draco found himself smacked right into the face. He was too stunned to react or even to feel pain. Only when he heard his mother's loud voice did he snap out of his shock. Lucius, she bellowed in a tone which he had never heard from her before. Raise your hand against our son one more time, and I swear you will regret it. Did you hear what he just said? His father shouted. Not only was he sassing me, but he was... I have ears, his mother interrupted him. Still, I will not tolerate violence against him. Not for any reason, Lucius. His father's shoulders were rigidly tense, and his jaw was working furiously, but he fell silent under the gaze of his wife. Finally, his mother's clear blue eyes fell on Draco, and some of the fierceness left them. Go up to your room, Draco, she ordered, much softer. I have to talk to your father. I will come up later. Draco nodded, feeling numb as he stood. His cheek was stinging painfully now, but he ignored it as he left his room and made his way up the stairs. The house elves had brought Aquila and his trunk up to his room already. The owl was sitting on a perch near the window, hooting gently as he entered. Mutely, he walked over to pet his feathers. It took about half an hour until his mother came up to see him. She knocked on the door softly, and when he called her in, she looked tired and grim. Let's sit,
she suggested, and Draco nodded as he joined her in the elegant sitting corner near the door. Only now he noticed that the elves had left hot tea under a stasis charm on the couch table, and his mother moved to pour them each a cup as they made themselves comfortable on the three-piece suite. "Here," she said, giving him his cup and holding it for a moment as she caught sight of his face. She reached out to stroke a gentle finger over his bruised cheek, her eyes troubled. Then she got out her wand and cast a quick healing spell. The pain immediately receded, though the skin still felt warm from the magic. "Tell me about your friends," she demanded at last. "I want to hear about them."
Draco gulped, and after a short moment of hesitation, he dove into a monologue about how he had met Harry at Diagon Alley, and how much Draco had wanted to be his friend, how he had met him again on the Hogwarts Express, this time with Weasley at his side, how Nott had turned all the Slytherins against him. He left out the details of their abuse, too ashamed to admit to such weakness in front of his mother, and how Harry had stuck up for him. He skimmed over the details of how Hermione had joined their group and told her instead about how smart the Muggle-born girl was and how he genuinely liked her despite her non-magical heritage. By the time he had finished, his mother's eyes were thoughtful and she was observing him carefully. "I know it's not what you wanted for me," Draco concluded, his voice rough now. "But they're my friends and they're important to me. Maybe not Weasley so much, I could do without Weasley. But Harry and Hermione." His mother's lips curled into almost a smile then. There was a moment of silence in which Draco took a nervous sip of his tea before she finally spoke. "I'm glad to hear that you seem to have found people who care about you and who are looking out for you," she said softly, "especially when your housemates seem to be less than welcoming. I'm alarmed at Theodore's behavior, though I suppose it shouldn't come as a surprise. You two have never gotten along very well." "I think that's an understatement," Draco muttered. His mother chuckled, taking a sip of her own tea. "If you think these children are worth befriending, and if they treat you well, I am not going to oppose your acquaintance with them," she said at last. "I trust your judgment, darling, and I want you to be happy. Just let me deal with your father." "He won't ever be all right with this," Draco reminded her. "You realize that, right?" "Of course I do," she assured him. "But you're your own person, and it's your decision to make. Your father and I might not always know what is best for you, as much as we'd like to think otherwise. You won't be the first boy to go against your parents' expectations, and you surely won't be the last. Times change, and your ideals might be different than ours. It will be on us to find a way to deal with that. Don't let it be your worry." "So you really aren't angry with me?" Draco checked his throat tight. "Oh, darling," his mother whispered as she pushed his fringe off his forehead in an affectionate gesture. "If every mother condemned her son over a generational conflict, there would be disowned 11-year-olds all over Hogwarts." Draco had to laugh at that, and suddenly he felt very light, as if the entire weight of his worries had been lifted off his shoulders all at once. As long as his mother was on his side, Draco figured, he could deal with his father's rages.